Now it's time for your money. Here's Joe Lynham.
Hello and welcome to Your Money, a weekly guide to personal finance. In a moment, we'll be looking at what your options are if you've been made redundant and some of the benefits which you could avail of. But first, in the face of rising debit and credit card fraud, one leading bank is rolling out new technology that means every customer transaction will be scrutinised for fraud. HSBC is introducing the programme which will affect 10 million bank cards. But there's a warning from the banking sector that more checks will mean even legitimate transactions could be queried and even cancelled. Sarah Pennells has more.
Would you like any cash back?
Card fraud is booming. The arrival of chip and pin saw a fall in fraud levels, but it's rising sharply once again. In the first 6 months of last year, card fraud was up 14% to over £300 million. But the banks are fighting back. HSBC is introducing a new programme which means it'll check every single transaction to see if it could be fraudulent. That's 10 million cards and millions of transactions.
When you put your card in the machine, it's carrying out an automatic check against your pattern of normal use and making a decision as to whether that transaction is actually a real and not a fraudulent transaction.
We did quite a lot of travel all over the north of Borneo.
The downside of this active screening is you might get stopped when you're making a legitimate transaction. That happened to Sally Weiber when she went on holiday to Borneo. She followed industry advice and told her bank where she was going. But that didn't stop her credit and debit cards being blocked when she tried to use them on her first day.
And I really spent the first day of my holiday, dealing with the bank, running around finding internet, then having to get through to people, and then have, quite a frustrating conversation on the phone to make sure that they would let me continue to use my credit card for the rest of my holiday.
But the banking industry says in the fight against fraud, we might have to accept some inconvenience.
We have to expect that from time to time we may be in a shop and find that our card has been stopped or the transaction declined because of these systems. These systems are there to protect us as customers, to stop our cards from being used fraudulently. So, if that's the price we have to pay, then I think people should be prepared to pay that price.
So when are you most at risk of having your card declined? Well, if you spend a large sum of money or use your card far more frequently than normal, that could raise alarms. But with fraud abroad now accounting for 40% of all card crime, it's when you're outside the UK that your card use is most likely to be queried. So the advice is you can't rely on your card, but you should pack plenty of cash as well.
Take a range of payment methods. Firstly, take some cash for immediate expenses. Do take one or two credit cards, preferably with different banks. And also take traveller's checks as well, for that extra security if things go disastrously wrong.
HSBC says most of the time when it blocks a card incorrectly, it's sorted out very quickly. But that it does acknowledge there are times when a customer may not have access to a phone when it's more difficult and when it can lead to real problems. But as the fight against fraud intensifies, you can't assume you can rely on your card. Sarah Pennells, BBC News.
Well, let's have a quick look at some of the other personal finance news this week. The government has announced that some Equitable Life savers will get partial compensation. The payments will go to those policyholders hardest hit when the pensions and life assurance company collapsed. 8 years ago, more than 1 million savers were left out of pocket when Equitable Life revealed it would not be able to pay out what it said it had promised. Last year, the Parliamentary Ombudsman ruled that regulators were partly to blame for Equitable's collapse and said that the government should pay up. The Irish government has decided to nationalise Anglo-Irish Bank rather than securing its future with a £1.3 billion handout. Around half of all Anglo-Irish depositors are British, many of whom moved their savings there at a time when all deposits were being guaranteed by the Irish government. That guarantee has since been reduced to £90,000, while the government here guarantees all savings up to £50,000. A scheme designed to stop thousands of vulnerable people losing their homes is being extended across England. A mortgage relief scheme worth £200 million has been introduced by the government. It will offer homeowners the chance to sell their house to a not-for-profit housing association and then rent it back, allowing them to continue living there. Northern Ireland, Wales and Scotland have or will soon have their own schemes in practice. Now, almost every single day, businesses are being forced to announce job cuts as they struggle to keep themselves afloat. This week, we've seen Barclays reveal more than 4,000 positions had to go. JCB said that almost 700 people were facing redundancy. And on Thursday, South West Trains axed 480 jobs. So, if you found yourself out of work and you're worrying about how to make ends meet, have a thought about what kind of financial help you might be entitled to. Well, official figures suggest that almost £10 billion of means-tested benefits went unclaimed in 2007 alone. Well, I'm joined this morning by Teresa Pritchard from Citizens Advice. Thank you very much, Teresa, for coming in. First of all, give us an idea of what kind of benefits are out there.
Okay. Well, firstly, if you've completely lost your job, or perhaps you have been partially laid off, you could get job seekers allowance from job centres. And if you're working on a low income with children, working more than 16 hours a week, or single, 30 hours a week, you could get a top up through the tax credit system. And those are the main things to be looking for: working tax credits or job seekers allowance. There's also help from your council with your rent, housing benefit or council tax benefit. A lot of people are not claiming help with council tax, which could make a big difference if you have a high council tax.
OK, what's the first port of call or even the second port of call? Where do you go and who do you talk to?
Well, you can get advice from Job Centre Plus, particularly if you're affected by redundancy or you've been partially laid off. And they've been putting a lot more effort into helping people actually find other jobs, because most people want to get back on their feet as quickly as possible. And it's really important to act quickly and go and get that advice as soon as possible. But you can also get advice from your local CAB.
That's Citizens Advice Bureau?
Citizens Advice Bureau. And we can help you work out a budget, take you through all of your options and tell you about all of your entitlements, both for benefits, tax credits, help from your council, other things you could do about help with your fuel bills perhaps as well that we could give advice on.
Now, what about those people who are being asked to work shorter hours, which means their income is cut? What happens to them?
This is quite complicated. First of all, check your employment contract. Is your employer actually allowed to unilaterally reduce your working hours or not? I mean, you could have a situation where, in effect, you're being unfairly dismissed, particularly if it goes on for a long period of time. Before it gets that far, if you're a member of a union, if you get advice from your trade union representative, and if you're not a member of a union, maybe it's a good time to think about joining, because they can give you advice on your employment rights at work. If you've been partially laid off, take action to top up your income if you can from the benefit system as soon as possible, because it can take a long time to deal with claims. Meanwhile, you've got to pay your bills.
You've got to pay your bills. Teresa Pritchard from Citizens Advice, thank you very much for joining us on BBC News. If you need any more advice, of course, you could always go to the website. That is bbcnews.co.uk/business for a lot more on that. And that is the Personal Finance News for now.
Joe, thanks very much indeed.